From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting live from Copenhagen. It's Climate Countdown.
El capitalismo es el peor enemigo de la humanidad.
Capitalism is the worst enemy of humanity.
El capitalismo, por tanto, el desarrollo irracional.
Capitalism, and I'm speaking about irrational development.
Políticas de industrialización ilimitada son los que destrozan el medio ambiente.
Policies of unlimited industrialization are what destroys the environment.
Bolivian President Evo Morales. He joins us today here in Copenhagen to talk about the UN climate talks, capitalism, climate debt, and much more. The UN summit is on the brink of collapse. The dispute between rich and poor countries on key issues remains unresolved. Civil society has largely been locked out. Today, we'll speak with the Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou, and we'll hear from the President of the Maldives, Mohamed Nasheed. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, broadcasting live from Copenhagen, where hopes are fading for a binding deal here at the Climate Summit, one day before the talks conclude. The Obama administration has been widely criticized for refusing to change its proposal to cut emissions by just 4% of 1990 levels. The European Union, by contrast, has offered to cut emissions by at least 20%. China, meanwhile, has also been faulted for reportedly trying to abandon a binding accord in favor of a political declaration. President Obama arrives in Copenhagen tomorrow on the summit's final day. A short while ago, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the U.S. would consider establishing a $100 billion annual climate aid fund for poorer nations. Clinton said the proposal is contingent on the Copenhagen talks resulting in a comprehensive deal.
And today, I'd like to announce that in the context of a strong accord in which all major economies stand behind meaningful mitigation actions and provide full transparency as to their implementation, the United States is prepared to work with other countries toward a goal of jointly mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020. To address the climate change needs of developing countries.
The U.S. proposal has already come under criticism as insufficient. Eric Pica of the group Friends of the Earth said, quote, "This looks like a shell game. The amount falls far short of what the United Nations says is needed, condemning the poorest to languish in poverty while the world suffers from climate chaos. In addition, loans and private investments must not substitute for public money, and it is unclear how much of this package is public," he said. Meanwhile, the crackdown on voices for climate justice continue inside and outside the summit. Scores of delegates from NGOs and civil society groups have been refused entry for a second consecutive day. Late last night, a group of youths staged a sit-in here at the Bella Center to protest their exclusion.
We'll stay here until there's a fair, ambitious, and legally binding agreement. And we are reading out the names of 11 million people who are standing behind us, and you have the same demands. And the action in itself is also a protest against the exclusion of civil society when heads of states arrive and actually decide upon what's going to be the agreement, and then civil society is going to be excluded, and that's not acceptable.
The UN has reportedly issued entry permits to just 300 of the thousands of accredited civil society delegates. Earlier today, Greenpeace Executive Director Kumi Naidoo criticized the restrictions.
And the questions of access, the questions of transparency and so on, while it started off quite well, it is in a very slippery downward slide at the moment. I think it is extremely unfortunate, firstly, that the civil society participation here has been shrunk to an absolute bare minimum.
Crackdown follows yesterday's arrest of over 230 people involved in the Reclaim Power People's Assembly outside the summit. You can go to our website at democracynow.org for our coverage of the protest from Wednesday's broadcast. The Ethiopian government is coming under criticism from African climate justice advocates over a joint proposal with France. The plan endorses Western calls for capping temperature increases at 2 degrees Celsius, shunning African calls for 1.5 degrees at the most. African delegates have warned a 2-degree cap is untenable for Africa's survival. Mathika Mwenda of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance said, quote, "The science is clear. 2 degrees is 3.5 degrees in Africa. This is death to millions of Africans." Climate justice activists say President Obama may have pressured the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi. This week, the White House said Obama had phoned Zenawi and praised him for taking, quote, "a leadership role." On the sidelines of the summit, a group of environmental groups have bestowed the mock Angry Mermaid Award to highlight corporations trying to thwart efforts against global warming. The biotech giant Monsanto finished in first place, followed by the oil giant Royal Dutch Shell and the oil lobby American Petroleum Institute. Paul de Klerk of Friends of the Earth International said richer nations are putting corporate profits above global survival.
The UN climate negotiations are moving further and further away from commitments from rich countries to reduce their emissions at home. We see that the solutions pushed for are mainly instruments that will generate big profits for companies, while most of these instruments do not result in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and some of them are even destroying the environment and local communities' rights.
We'll have more from Copenhagen after headlines. Capitol Hill Independent Senator Bernie Sanders has withdrawn a measure for single-payer health care after a Republican effort to thwart its consideration. On Wednesday, Sanders tried to introduce his proposal for a Medicare for All health system as an amendment to the Senate health care reform bill. But before debate could begin, Republican Senator Tom Coburn insisted the 767-page measure be read in its entirety. Sanders withdrew the amendment after nearly 3 hours, but vowed not to give up the fight for single-payer.
The day will come, although I recognize it is not today, when the United States Congress will have the courage to stand up to the private insurance companies and the drug companies and the medical equipment suppliers and all of those who profit and make billions of dollars every single year off of human sickness. And on that day, when it comes, and it will come, the United States Congress will finally proclaim that health care is a right of all people and not just a privilege.
Sanders, meanwhile, has also announced he opposes the Senate health care bill in its current form. He is the first progressive senator to withdraw support for the bill since it was revised to meet the demands of independent Senator Joseph Lieberman. On Sunday, Lieberman announced he would oppose the bill unless Democrats abandon both the proposal to expand Medicare eligibility as well as any type of public option. In other news from Washington, the House has approved a new spending bill, including $128 billion for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Democrats say the amount does not factor in the additional funds that'll be needed for President Obama's recent orders to deploy over 30,000 more troops. A new congressional study, meanwhile, says the escalation of the Afghan war will require tens of thousands of new contractors. The Congressional Research Service says it expects the Obama administration to send between 26,000 and 56,000 contractors along with the additional troops. A House Oversight Subcommittee, meanwhile, has opened a probe into allegations Pentagon contractors have paid Afghan insurgent groups to protect U.S. supply routes from attack. A recent report in The Nation magazine said 10% of the Pentagon's logistics contracts consist of payments to the Taliban.